God, please help me set aside everything I think I know about myself, the 12 steps, the big book, the meetings, my disease, and you, God, so that I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please let me see the truth. Thank you, Matt. And with that, I'm going to share one more time the notes that Pat's going to share with us this evening, and I'm going to go ahead and pitch it over to him. So please help me welcome Pat.
Yay! Alex, thank you. Pat Alcoholic. Guys, I am so happy to be here. It's one of my absolute favorite topics, and it's been a practice that I absolutely love for, I was thinking back now, I got sober in 2002. God struck me sober, and I started the two-way prayer practice in 2003. So it's going for a long, long time in my life. Well, not long by some of you guys on the phone. I mean, I got some dear friends from Arizona here and some Californians that are like 40 years sober plus. So I'm a lightweight. I'm only 18 years. So I always look up to folks that have been walking this path for a lot longer. So, one of the things I wanted to do before we actually get into the prayer practice, I want to make I want to paint a picture. And the first picture I want to paint is the two-way prayer is directly mentioned in our big book. It's directly mentioned, not by name, but by practice. So if you got a big book, turn over to page 85. And the first thing that Bill talks about or not the first thing, but one of the things that Bill talks about, I'm going to go fast. So hang in there with me. New Yorkers, you guys love it, I know. And West Coasters, hang in there with me. We're going to go fast for a little bit. And then Alex, I think we're on the scene till 8:30, I know, but let's stop at like about 10 till. Let's give me about 50 minutes, 50, okay? And that way we have plenty of time for everybody to share, because I don't want this thing to turn into a monologue. I really don't. But I want to make sure I get this thing out the way that's been instructed to me, and we'll go from the start. Here we go. Okay, in step 10, Bill W., the guys that wrote this big book, they said, every day is a day when we must carry the vision of God's will in all of our activities. How can I best serve thee? Thy will be done. Not mine, thy will. Okay? So that's in step 10. That's saying to us very clearly, we have an accountability to God for the rest of our life to carry the vision that God gives us into all of our activities on a daily basis. That's part of the deal we signed up for when God strikes us sober and keeps us sober for the rest of our lives. That's the deal in the big book. It's not one day at a time. It's for the rest of our lives. How does that happen? How did we get a 93% success rate in Cleveland? How do we get a 75% success rate in Akron? How did we only have less than 8% in New York? It's a direct result of two-way prayer. It's a direct result of dependence on our higher power, on God as we know God. Okay, then I want to just point out in step 11, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to point out the paragraph, starting with the paragraph at the bottom of page 86. In thinking about our day, we may face indecision. It tells us that we're going to ask God. Every time I see ask God, that means pray. Ask God means pray. That's code word for pray. I pray for God for inspiration, an intuitive thought, a decision. Later on, it tells me I don't struggle. It says that I'm going to pray for the right thought or action as I go about the day. In the next page, on page 87, it says, what used to be a hunch and an occasional inspiration gradually becomes a working part of my mind. Being still inexperienced and having just made conscious contact with God, it is not probable that I'm going to be inspired at all times. And in fact, it says this, watch out, and it's okay. We're all going to stub our toes. Get used to it. We might pay for this presumption. What presumption? That my two-way prayer is really God-inspired. That my two-way prayer, I'm really getting in touch with God. And sometimes I miss the mark. And we'll talk about that. It says, I'm going to pay for this presumption in all sorts of absurd actions and ideas. Absurd is a fancy word. You know what it means in the Latin? It simply means deaf, hard of hearing. I didn't get it. My circuit was a little bit clouded. I didn't hear clearly what was going on. I missed it. God, can you tell me that again? And then in the next paragraph, we usually conclude this period of meditation, a prayer shown all through the day what the next step is to be. It sounds to me that we have an expectation because of this big book and following these instructions precisely that God is going to reveal next indicated steps to us on a daily basis. I took that at face value. I took that as a challenge. And my results in my life for 17 years is absolutely true. And then there's this cryptic paragraph that hardly ever anybody ever talks about. I hardly ever hear it in meetings, and it's vital. If circumstances warrant, this is the second to last paragraph on page 87, we ask our wives or friends to join us in morning meditation. The morning meditation that Bill W. is talking about there is what he, Ann Smith, Dr. Bob experienced in Akron, Ohio in 1935 from June until September. Every morning they would get up. Ann would sit in her favorite chair. She would read some stuff out of the Bible. They would talk a little bit about what's going on for the day, and then they would get quiet and go into the two-way prayer process. And after the two-way prayer process was over, they would sit amongst themselves and they would share the guidance that they each wrote down from that practice with each other to take instruction for that specific day. How cool is that? And later on, Bill says this in the reflection later on in readings in the Grapevine. He said, I think we lost something for AA when we quit emphasizing the quiet time in the morning. It was when a period when AA was moving away from God, more into this conceptual self-help kind of crazy time frame that was going on in AA, and they were missing the mark. They were missing the mark where it's a God-inspired, God-directed, God-empowered program. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background in the book directly where this two-way prayer comes from. And then what is the two-way prayer? Okay, it came from somewhere. What organization did it come from? It came from the Oxford Group. The Oxford Group was described by historians back in the 1930s as a first century Christian kind of movement. And I'm going to quote a book, and it's called, and don't freak out with the name. It's called For Sinners Only. Don't freak out. It's a great book. A.J. Russell wrote it. And has anybody ever seen this book called The 24 Hours? Have anybody ever seen that? The 24 hours a day, like the little devotional comes out of Hazleton? Well, that book comes from, that book is a reflection from this book called God Calling. And God Calling is edited by this guy, A.J. Russell. God Calling is a story of two ladies in England that wrote down their two-way prayer guidance every single day for 365 days. They compared it with each other, and then they jointly put this in writing. And it's a cool devotional to pick up. It's called God Calling. You can pick it up on Amazon, and it's great. And of course, it's not AA approved literature, so don't send prayers and messages to me about it. I know that. But anyway, here's what A.J. Russell says. Now, you just got to hear this. From the end of 1923 until the middle of 1926, I was a literary editor for perhaps the most virile and progressive London daily newspaper. During this period, certain events happened which drew me into the heart of the most, here's his description of Oxford Group people, the most astonishing group of people I shall ever meet. Today, groups of them are sprinkled about the earth, changing the lives of those who they encounter, giving all they possess and asking no return. They are not an organization. No one can tell their number. For in their own words, you can't join us, you can't resign from us, you are either in or out by the quality of the life you live. They probably are the most extraordinary association of Christian adventurers since the first century that I've ever seen. That's A.J. Russell. A.J. Russell, by the way, was not a religious guy, but he was absolutely blown away by the quality and character of these Oxford group people. And these Oxford group people were using two-way prayer. Okay, then another thing that they said, just real quick, hang in there with me. I know it's a lot of quotes, but it's worth it. It really is. He describes it this way about what they bet their lives on, these Oxford group people, which, by the way, is the very same bet that I'm asking each person on this call to bet our lives on. I bet my life on this practice 17 years ago, and to date, I haven't regretted it. The word religion, when it was written back in 1926, was not talking about a denomination. It was talking about just a quality God experience, okay? A God-inspired experience. So religion is a betting your life that there is a God. I decided to bet my life there is a God, and more as the years go by, I find that insofar as I've yielded up my will to God and opened my heart to his indwelling, insofar as I try to live out my life in the Christ spirit, the experiment works. And then the final thing is this. We all are gamblers in life who are adventurers. We gamble recklessly with our own lives, gambling on the reality of God. All right? And then that is enough of the quotes. Now, some quick background, and then we're going to be jumping into the actual practice. I think I'm good on my time, I think. This is important to hear. So the linkage of the Oxford group and their practice of two-way prayer found its way directly into our steps 10 and 11. And in fact, the Oxford group is just all over our big book. If you want to know where our big book 12 steps come from, it's the Oxford group. It truly is. I mean, there's some debating on some of this stuff, but I'm telling you, that's the majority of where it's coming from. And the two-way prayer was actually used by people that were around Bill W. and by Dr. Bob. There are some people that you might notice. Let me just put some people out there that you might know these names who were in the Oxford group at the time and actively used two-way prayer. Does anybody recognize the name Thomas Edison? How about Henry Ford, founder of Ford Motor Company? How about Harvey Firestone? How about Charles Lindbergh, the great air pilot? Sam Shoemaker, who was a spiritual advisor to Ebby, to Bill, to Roland Hazard, to Shep Cornell, to, just a bunch of folks. And then somebody you probably not going to know the name of unless you're a history buff in AA, Henrietta Seiberling. Henrietta was the daughter-in-law of Frank Seiberling, who was the founder of Goodyear Company. So it gives you a little bit of a feel for who in the era was using the two-way prayer, okay? So here's the backdrop. Dr. Bob can't get sober. He's in the Oxford group for 2.5 years before he ever met Bill W. For 2.5 years, he's doing this two-way prayer stuff. He's going to the meetings. He's getting indoctrinating with the 4 steps of the Oxford group, which are, first of all, surrender, which is our steps 1, 2, and 3. The second was sharing, which is our steps 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then restitution, which is our step 8 and 9, and then guidance, which was our step 10, 11, and 12. So Dr. Bob is doing all of these spiritual practices for 2.5 years and he can't get sober. And so in one of the two-way prayer guidance sessions that Henrietta Seiberling had, she felt like God was saying to her, bring something new to the group tomorrow night. And she goes to the group tomorrow night and she says, what I'm hearing, and again, no one's putting words in God's mouth, but she says, my guidance is telling me, we're going to try it out, that we're supposed to next week bring something new to this group that we've never shared. Now, they've been going to this group together for 2.5 years. And so the next week, Dr. Bob shows up, and for the first time, Dr. Bob says these words: I am an alcoholic and I cannot stop drinking. I've tried everything I know to do to stop drinking. I thought this Oxford group would save me, and it hasn't. I don't know what to do. That's what Dr. Bob brought to the group after 2.5 years, never having spoken it publicly. 2 weeks later, guess who shows up in Akron, Ohio on a failed business deal? Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson, two-way guidance in prayer, says, I think I'm going to drink again. What am I going to do? Asks instantaneously in two-way prayer, what's my next indicated step? He's directed to the directory of Mayflower Hotel, sees a name, Walter Tunks, the only Oxford group preacher in the town that's really going and doing this deal. He calls up Walter Tunks. Tunks says, I don't have any drunks for you, Bill. I hear what you're trying to do. I know that you're worried about drinking. I know you want to talk to another alcoholic. I don't know what to tell you, but I got a feeling, because he practiced two-way prayer, call up Henrietta Seiberling. Bill Wilson's scared to death. He asks for direction from God. He doesn't want to call Henrietta Seiberling because he thinks it's the wife of Frank Seiberling, owner of Goodyear Tire. He's freaking out. God, what should I do? Call the number. Bill takes guidance and calls the number. Who does he reach? Henrietta, the daughter-in-law who's living in the gatehouse. That lady says, hey, I've been waiting for you, Bill, for 2 weeks. I knew that God was going to answer my prayer. Bill says, what are you talking about? We had a guidance session 2 weeks ago, and I know exactly who to put you in touch with. She puts him in touch with Dr. Bob. I'll spare the rest of the story. AA is formed. Two-way prayer works. Our history, our very history of AA is steeped in the reality of two-way prayer, because of men that were faithful and women that were faithful to the belief that God would speak to them and that they could follow the guidance and good things would happen. Not always easy things, but good things, things that would take them higher and farther and freer in their lives than they ever dreamed possible. Is that worthwhile? Thumbs up, thumbs down for a background. Is that helpful? Okay, good deal. All right. Then here's what the backdrop was. Just a couple more comments and we'll be set. Ooh, I'm excited. Yeah, I get so excited. I can't help it. All right. Here's some backdrop to some of the comments that people were freaking out about. Here's what one of the, I'll give you all the reference sources that I'm using. I've read, I'm not exaggerating, probably 60 or 70 books on the Oxford group, maybe more over the years. I love the Oxford group. I love the practices, and we integrate them back actively in our fellowship all over the place. But here is what one of the writers who wrote a book called God Who Speaks, he said, we have this thing called pagan prayer. The attempt here, ask yourself if you've ever done this, because one of the prayers in the step 11 says, be careful not to do what? Pray for our own selfish ends. We could all easily see why, correct? You know, it goes into that in the step 11 practice. Here's what this guy named B.H. Streeter says. We attempt to bend God to our desires and make God the servant of our needs. We have made our plans and decisions first and then sought God's blessing and assistance. Have you ever done that? God, here's my plan. I want you to just take care of it now. I've got it. I just need your power. Come on, just lend your assistance here. This one-sided address by us to God is unproductive. So eventually we drop it and complain that two-way prayer doesn't work. See, if I have an agenda before I even go into two-way prayer, I've set myself up for failure. Does that make sense? Failure is a strong word. Lack of effect would be a better word. And then there was another thing. This was by a guy named Cecil Rhodes, which is one of my favorite authors of all time, and he's in the 1920s. He wrote a book called When Man Listens, and it's a beautiful statement. He says, when man listens, God speaks, and when man obeys, God acts. Isn't that a great statement? When man listens, God speaks. When man obeys, God acts. And that's a direct quote from Cecil Rhodes. But here's what he says. In order for prayer to be successful, we must begin with a desire to know God's will for us and to be brought under its control. Our petitions will be answered only if we have first placed ourselves in line with God's will. If God is the director of our lives, it's vital that we should learn how to listen. In the third step, everybody in the call, we turned our will and our lives over to who? The care of God. And what did we ask God to do hereafter? Hereafter, God's going to be our director. He's going to guide us. God's going to be our father. He's going to protect us. God's going to be our principal. He's going to empower us. God is our creator. He has a plan for our lives. God is our employer. He supplies all of our needs as we do and follow God's leading. It's so beautiful how this thing sort of sets up. It just is. And I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to give one more descriptor. Victor Kitchen's another guy that I love. He wrote a book called I Was a Pagan. And he says this. Victor Kitchen was this is about Victor Kitchen, was skeptical that God's plan could be revealed to him. He had tried to pray, but to no avail. Then he realized he had to change his approach. I had previously failed to learn God's plan for the simple reason that I had been trying to supply all the power myself. Even after I learned that power for spiritual growth would have to come from inside. God deep down within. Wow. How many times have I tried in my life to spiritually manage my growth? You know, God just simply asked me to do these steps, and it's up to God to do God stuff. It's up to God to make results happen as a result of doing these steps. And it's beautiful. It's so much bigger than anything I could ever imagine. And here was the last quote, and then we're going to jump fast into some really good stuff. The idea of getting directly in touch with God by asking questions and getting answers and directions to the conduct of my life seemed to me an out and out absurdity. This is Victor Kitchen. This is a guy that ended up turning the world upside down for the Oxford Group, wrote a cool book, and this guy was a street smart son of a gun. Yet these people said it could be done. They said that they were doing it themselves, and that was what gave them the power to apply beliefs and carry out the plan of God. See, if God's going to direct me and God's going to give me a course of action to take, he better give me the power to do it in. There's nothing more frustrating in this universe than trying to do something that you think God is leading you to do and there's no power behind it. It's an absolute disaster. A power that I did not have. They said, however, that I could have it just as they did if I would pay the same price, comply with the same conditions, and go through the same series of exceedingly simple steps. So now I'm going to ask you guys some questions, and then we're going to go into the two-way prayer. And the questions I'm going to ask you, I'm not asking you to make an answer right now, but what I want you to do is reflect on steps 1 through 9, if you will, okay? In step 1, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, do I have the gift of desperation to seek God as if a drowning man seeking a reed? Step 2, am I convinced that I suffer from a lack of access to vital and revolutionary power to change the way I'm living and thinking? Step 3, am I convinced that any life lived on self-will can hardly be a success? Am I clear that it is delusional thinking to believe I can wrestle satisfaction, an internal condition, and happiness, an external experience, out of life by me managing it on my own power. Another thing from step 3. Do I believe that playing God in my life does not work? That God is my Father who will love and protect me, my director who will guide me, and my principal who will empower me? Do I believe God is my creator, that I am the one-of-a-kind special person made for constant companionship and adventure with him, creation, usefulness to God's purpose and plans? Step 4. Do I believe that the spiritual maladjustment, spiritual malady must be overcome, or I will not straighten out mentally and physically? Pretty straightforward. Step 5. Do I believe that God is able to remove anything that's blocking me off from him? Am I trying to have a new attitude, a new relationship with my creator, and to have removed any obstacles in my path that I discover? These are reflection questions. Steps 6 and 7. Do I believe willingness is indispensable for being set free? Am I willing to go to a place in my program tonight that I've never been before? Can God have everything that I deem objectionable in my life? Step 7. Am I now ready to have God in prayer? God, you can have everything, good and bad. You can remove anything that's blocking me off from you and my fellows. Do I believe God will give me strength to do God's bidding? Step 8 and step 9, real quick, or actually step 9. Do I believe that the real purpose of this is a hard one. Hear me on this. Step 9. Do I believe that real purpose of my life is to be of maximum service to God and my fellows? It doesn't say anywhere in step 9 that do I believe that the real purpose of my life is to enjoy my life for my needs, for my satisfaction forever. It's weird. Bill W. says uncommon thinking will become common thinking. See, I don't believe when I first entered this program that it's all about serving you. I think it's all about getting from you to serve me. It's the exact opposite. And then as we go into last thing on step 9, and then we're jumping. Do I believe I must complete all of my amends, no matter what the consequences when necessary? See, the Oxford group believed they brought three things to the table, big time. And here they are. The first thing they brought to the table were their 4 steps. They said you had to surrender because our lives didn't work. They said next that we had to share it. We had to go through a moral inventory, and we had to get honest with somebody, and we had to ask God to remove it, what we found objectionable. And then they got into restitution. They made restitution to everybody and anybody they had harmed. Sound familiar? And then finally, they practiced 2-way prayer and guidance for the rest of their lives and to be a maximum service to God and their fellows. They checked their 2-way guidance through another thing that they brought to the world, which was the 4 absolutes. And if anybody, raise your hand if you've heard of the 4 absolutes. There were 4. It was invented by a guy named Sangster in. It really doesn't matter. It's just history buffing. But anyway, he read this Presbyterian minister read the Sermon on the Mount out of the Bible, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He said, here's my summary of what Jesus' teachings were. Absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute love, absolute unselfishness. It sounds a little bit about the things we have to watch out for in our step 10 inventory on a daily basis, in our evening reflection in step 11, in our master inventory column 4 of the resentments in step 4. Where was I resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid? Didn't that sound like the opposites of each one of those absolutes? That's exactly where it's coming from. Absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, absolute purity, absolute love. All right. Enough of the backdrop. God says, Bill W. put it in the big book on page 49. He said, the way that we're supposed to view ourselves as we go forward in this life of being recovered alcoholics, addicts, or whatever your situation is to view yourselves as an intelligent agent of God's ever advancing creation. You are the spearhead of God's ever advancing creation. That's directly out of the Oxford Group Principles of Guidance. That's directly out of the Oxford Group two-way prayer, saying, I can expect to be an agent for God. I know it sounds like the Blues Brothers. Remember the Blues Brothers movie where they're agents for God? Never mind. Probably don't remember. If you do remember, you know what I'm talking about. Agents for God. But we're agents for God, and we are involved in God's creative enterprise on a daily basis. So with that backdrop and those considerations from our steps and where did the Oxford Group come from, we're going to spend the next 15 minutes, if you will, showing exactly, now I'm going to share a screen and we're going to go through the actual process. And hopefully this is going to be helpful to everybody. I think it will. We've already talked about a bunch of this stuff, but on this site, by the way, this guide, you can find this also on a website called twowayprayer.org, and it's by a guy by the name of Father Bill W. There's probably a lot of you in the room that know who that is. This guy, back when he had some podcasts out, he was like 46, 47, 48 years sober, and he really bought off on two-way prayer. And so he said, he put it up on his website. So John Batterson, who came up with the actual two-way prayer, a Presbyterian minister in the 30s, who floated this out to the Akron groups in the early 30s, he simply said the following things. If you're going to try out two-way prayer, and we've done a lot of setup for this, so I'm going to go quickly over part of this stuff. He said, you got to have some basic, you got to take a leap of faith. Just like we jump from logic, the bridge to shore, from logic to faith. We got to give this thing a try. Sam Shoemaker used to tell all of his guys, he said, listen, try the grand experiment. Give all you know about yourself to all you know about God and see what happens. It was that simple. He didn't complicate it. So he said, here's the premise. Believe that God's alive, that he's always been alive, and he's always going to be there. Number 2, believe that God knows everything. Number 3, believe that God can do anything and everything. Number 4, God can be everywhere at the same time. In other words, he's always present. Number 5, he's invisible. Sort of a bummer. So I can't see God. And frankly, in all my years of two-way prayer, I've never heard an audible thing of God. I've never had a visual sighting of God. Probably be dead if I did. But anyway, the bottom line is he speaks differently to us. In the Oxford Group, they say, listen, God speaks to us through our thoughts, just like we think our prayers to God in our thoughts. That's been my experience. God speaks to us through our thoughts. And by the way, God doesn't come through to me like thous and these and thines. God comes through in Pat language so that Pat can understand it. God's going to come through in Alex's language. God's going to come in John's language and Jose's language and Matt's language and Jackie and Jerry's language. God's going to come in each one of our lives, our language, how we're uniquely put together. Number 6, God cares very much about us. Number 7, God's going to tell us all that we need to know, not necessarily what we want to know, but what we need to know. Number 8, God is going to help us do anything that he asks us to do. And number 9, anyone can get in touch with God anywhere, anytime, if the conditions are obeyed. The coolest thing, and I'll show you evidence in my own life, just give you some samplings. But now we're going to go into the actual practice. Whoops. So it says here, just right there, be quiet and still, listen, be honest, test it, and then obey it. So this is where it gets a little wonky. And this is where people that I do two-way prayer with get a little bit scared, because I was talking to my peeps that I keep accountable to out here in California. And I was talking to Jose early this morning. He goes, Pat, just be careful, because not everything that they hear is from God. And, watch out for people going off the deep end kind of thing. And I said, yeah, I'm with you on that. It's a crazy risk. And so here are the conditions, and just bear with me as we walk through these, okay? And I didn't leave a ton of time for the actual steps because it's not complicated. I wanted to make sure everybody knew where this was coming from, and then we're going to have discussion about it. So the first thing it says when we're going to do two-way prayer, take time is step number one. Find some place and time where you can be alone. Usually I do this the very first thing in the morning before the sun is even up. And there's something about me, Pat, that my defenses are down. The first thing I do, I roll out of bed and I say, God, please separate from me divorce from my thinking, self-pity, dishonest, and self-seeking motives. I do that every morning. I just have for a long, long time. And I don't know, it's a lucky rabbit's foot, whatever you want to call it, but it works for me because I find that my thinking is on a higher plane. And then when it's still, I get a cup of coffee, I sit down in my favorite spot in my room, and I relax. I sit number two, comfortable position. I just get relaxed. I'm not in a hurry. The Oxford group used to say this, God has all the time in the world. How much time do you have for God? That's a big one to me. God, I'm too busy to talk to you today. I got way too many important things to do. People, I don't say this for any other reason. That's the truth for me today. My most important scheduled event and my most important meeting of the day is with my God. Absolutely number one. Nothing takes a precedent over that. Nothing. And it's not because I have this obsessive compulsive need to always follow my rule. I just wouldn't want to miss my time with my pop. I love hanging out with my pop. I do. I'm just telling you, that's my truth. Then number three, it says, tune in, open up my heart, either silently or loud, and just say to God in a natural way that you would like his plan for my life. And that if he wants to answer any problem or situation I'm facing now, I'm going to follow. I'm going to be definite. So here's what happens to me. And the reason I read those considerations to everybody on our steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 is you can start practicing two-way prayer with those considerations. Take those considerations to God and ask him if there's anything he wants to reveal to you about where you are in any of your step work. It's a great place to start. If you're having a problem with your marriage, if you're having a problem with your friend, if you're having a problem with your finances, you're having a challenge in business or whatever else it is, bring that up to your pop. Bring it up to your higher power. Talk to him about it. God, this is what's going on. This has me wrapped around the axle a little bit. I'm not sure what to do. I know I'm in this world to serve your purposes, but this sure seems to be bugging me a lot, and I'm not sure what you want me to do. You're the director. You're the principal. You're my father. What would you like to do about this? And I'm going to give you some concrete examples out of my life here in a second. The next thing, listen. That's the hardest thing in the world for me. I don't know about you guys, but I used to have a committee up in my head, and it was busy. It had a thought about everything, and it had an opinion about everyone. And it was nonstop. It was like the gerbil cage had been loosed, and it was just couldn't stop the people from talking in my head. And it says, just be still, quiet, relax, and open. Let your mind go loose. Let God do the talking. And here's the weird thing. Thoughts and ideas and impressions will begin to come to your mind and heart. Be alert, be aware, be open to every one of them. Here's what I do, guys, on a practical level. See this? It's just a two-way prayer journal. And I've got about 50 of these in my closet. And they go back years and years and years. And this current one started on September the 17th. And I have my last entry today on 10:30. And I'll give you a couple shots. Pat, keep it simple. Less is best. Intuition, inspiration, decision, thought, action grow more effective as my knowledge and obedience increases. Understanding. Join in the morning meditation. Resources, make sure you tell them about those. And then I had some other things that were directly business related, on what I needed to do. But the bottom line is I just write down literally whatever comes into my head. Everything, nothing's off limits, nothing. And I know it sounds crazy, but just give it a try. So here's what it says about this writing. Here's the important key in the whole process. Just write down everything that comes to your mind. Everything. Write it as simply it means recording as you can. Remember it later. So I don't write complete sentences. I write one word. As an example, one of the things that came to me about a year ago was hire better than you. I'm in a job where I am second in command of a pretty big company, and I'm not very good at certain tasks that I was tasked to be good at. And so I came to my boss after I heard this guidance and I checked it out with my people that I do checking with. And I said, boss, I'm really feeling strongly that we need to fire me. And he said, what are you talking about? I said, I need to fire myself from 2 positions in our company and I need to hire better than me. And I've got some ideas. Are you open to that? He goes, it's the craziest thing I've ever heard, but yeah, I'm open to it. And we ended up hiring 2 people 4 years ago that have revolutionized our company. They're better than I ever could have been at the 2 job sectors that I needed them to be really good at. And our people are much more better served. Recently, I had another one of those about a month ago. And I said to God, God, please quit doing this because someday I'm going to be out of a job altogether. So he asked me, I said, God, we got too much on our plate on this one area. And he said, hire better than yourself. Same words exactly as I heard 4 years ago. And I go, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, this is going to be a mess. And so I bring it up to my boss, and my boss says, that's funny. I was thinking the same thing, that you're overwhelmed and having too much on your plate. If we could find somebody that could partner up with you, would that be helpful? He had already put the budget together. He had already put the money aside to do the very thing that God revealed to me about 2 months ago. We hired the person in one interview in 20 minutes, and it's a 6-figure job. That's how God rolls. Now, I'm going to give you one example, writing down everything that it didn't turn out so well because I didn't do any checking. This is about 10 years ago, and I'm working for Merrill Lynch. And Merrill Lynch, my job was to do some people, nothing's too insignificant. Nothing's too, if you don't even understand why you're writing it down, write it down anyway. I've written down things that I had no idea what it was about, and it was revealed later. Because like the evening review in step 11, I'm going to review my daily guidance and see what God was up to. Okay, and here's how I run it through the filter on a very practical level. Number 6, on the test, is it completely honest, pure, unselfish, and loving? Not everything I'm thinking and not everything I'm writing down comes from God. Like years ago, one of my things that was going on in my life was having some rough times with my first ex-wife. And I thought one of my guidance options was cut all communication with her permanently. And I wrote that down. And I'm talking to my guidance buddy, and he goes, you got kids, right? And I go, yeah, I got kids. And you got alimony, and you still got like 5 more years of stuff with them, right? Yeah, I do. Then why would you cut all communication if you're going to be co-parenting? I don't think that's on solid ground. So first thing I'm going to run it through is a filter. Is it honest? When I write down my guidance and I get done with it, and now I'm looking at it, I got done with my time. And how long is your time? I don't know. It could be 5 minutes, it could be 50 minutes, it can be whatever you have. So is it honest? Is it pure? Is it unselfish? And some quick reminders on how to get there on some of these things. I wrote this down. Hold on a second. Sure, I can't find it. There it is. Okay, so an honest is pretty factual. Is it true or false? Purity, fancy word. According to your moral code, according to your philosophical convictions, according to what you know of God exposed in your life, is it right or is it wrong? That's what purity means in practicality. Unselfish. Do you believe it to be God-directed or self-directed? You got to sort of look under the hood to see if you're really trying to cozy up with spiritual terms on a selfish action. Does that make sense? And then finally, love. Is it based on faith? God, I'm going to go in a direction that I believe you have me going in. Or do you believe it's based on fear, anxiety, worry, restlessness? It's an agitated state. Okay? So you get these all down. Is it in line with our duties, our family, our country, all those kind of things, spiritual literature, the things that you're reading? Step 10 tells me to increase my knowledge about this God of my understanding. It says, go out and use some. In step 11, it says, go out and find some spiritual books from the people that you respect and get to know your God. Learn, grow, understanding, effectiveness. That's how we do it. Okay, then you've heard me say this all along, checking, and then I'm going to be done here in moments, Alex, I promise. Checking. When in doubt, if it's important and another person who is doing two-way prayer, by the way, don't do this with somebody that's not doing two-way prayer. You got to have somebody that's trying to do the same kind of stuff we're doing. It's like trying to do a fifth step with somebody that's never done the work. If I'm going to read my inventory to somebody, I want the person I'm reading my inventory to have gone through all these steps. Doesn't that make sense? So I'm going to do the same thing with two-way prayer. I'm going to make sure the person I'm working with has done this two-way prayer. I'm going to talk it over. I'm going to run it through those filters. I'm going to see if this makes sense. By the way, if any of you guys did the principal inventory workshop we put on a couple of weeks ago, that principal inventory workshop, it's up on the BBA website now, but that was an idea that came to me in a morning meditation two-way prayer about 6 months ago, and I kept getting a holding pattern. Not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet. And I'm bouncing off the people that two-way prayer with me. And they said, not yet, not yet, not yet. And I'm getting a little tired of the not yet. If you guys can imagine, I'm not much a not yet person. I'm sort of a get it done guy. And it was hard to sort of sit on my hands. It really was. But about a month ago, I got now is the time. And so we pulled it out, did the deal. And I think it turned out pretty well. It was fun. It was a good experience. And then here's the key. If I'm not willing to obey, God's probably not going to be real action or active with me in my thinking. Carry out the thoughts that come. You're going to have sure guidance as you go through it. Okay, you will only be sure of guidance as you go through it. A rudder will not guide a boat until the boat is moving. As you obey, very often the results will convince you that you're on the right track. Sam Shoemaker, the Episcopalian minister in New York, with Ebby and Bill and a bunch of other guys, he used to say, try this great experiment. Test God and see if he's good. In other words, go with what you believe. Sam Shoemaker was a big believer in two-way prayer. And he said, you know what? Carry it out. If it's according to the four absolutes and it's not jamming you up, carry it out and find out what happens. And it's a grand adventure, people. This is not boring with God. God is not boring. And by the way, when I came in here, I was not a God fan. I was not in God's camp. I didn't want any part of God. And now I want more and more and more and more, and I can't get enough time, and I can't be enough about God's stuff. Okay, the blocks. Last couple things and we're done. What if I don't get any definite guidance? I'm not receiving any thoughts. Oxford Group had a theory about this, and here was their theory. Usually it's because there is something I will not do. I was jammed up with the IRS years ago, and I had to come clean with the IRS and get some stuff figured out. And my my time with God was blocked up because God's revelation to me in my two-way prayer was get straight with the IRS. Don't delay. And I thought, yeah, and I wouldn't do it. And I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. I was in too much fear, guys. I was convinced that I'd get pounded into the ground. See, I believe the IRS was more powerful than my God. In my experience is my God's more powerful than the IRS. And so I finally got honest, and I finally went and I finally did what was required. And all of a sudden my two-way prayer the pipeline started flowing again. Okay. So sometimes I'm in a habit that God's telling me don't be doing. If some people, I don't know how everybody else is on the line, but porn is a big deal for guys and gals. And if you're doing porn, sometimes that's going to jam you up if that's not part of your sexual ideal. And if there's porn watching, there's this or that, if there's some habits that you're doing, it's something that you just feel that God doesn't want you involved in, but you're doing it anyway, it's going to be hard to hear the two-way guidance if I'm not willing to give up stuff. Sometimes it means I have to move towards stuff. It's not always giving up. How about, do I have a person I won't forgive? Do I have a relationship that I'm involved in that I shouldn't be involved in? You know, it's your own moral code and it's your own philosophical conviction. But most people are pretty well convinced that having an affair on your wife or your husband is probably not in your best interest for two-way prayer. Just saying. So if that's going on, maybe it's a wrong relationship. Maybe it's a relationship that you haven't come clean on. Restitution not made. You know what it is. It was in your harm's list and you're sitting on it and it's really there. You could get it done, but you're not willing to do it. Something God has already told me to do that I will not obey. Check these points and try listening again. So it simply means if God's going to call me to make an amends, if God's going to call me to do something that's uncomfortable, God's also going to give me the power to carry it out. And the more I carry it out, the more I grow. It's almost like I get more spiritual muscles. Does that make sense? My spiritual muscles grow as I take action. And mistakes, yeah, I gave you a couple mistakes that I made. When I came out to San Diego, one of the things I was convinced is that God was calling me to get Joe Hawk and Mark Houston, they were both alive, to speak in San Diego. And I take that over to the area assembly in Area 8 of San Diego. And guess what? They weren't convinced that they had heard from God the way I had heard from God. Mark Houston and Joe Hawk were some guys in the BBA world that are really thorough in the big book, very, very insightful, incredible people. And I wanted people to hear about them. And man, it wasn't happening. And I knew that God was saying not yet, but I ignored it. And you know what happened? I was invited this January in 2020 to share about my experience, strength, and hope around Mark Houston and Joe Hawk and the BBA way of doing the work at Area 8. Now, how does that happen? I was 14 years early. That's all. I was 14 years early. God works it out. God's plans don't get screwed up. He always figures it out. God is bigger than what I screw up. He can always fix it. And the results, I love this statement. Never know what swimming is like until we get in the water and try it. We'll never know what it's like until we sincerely try this two-way prayer. When man listens, God speaks. When man obeys, God acts. That's what the law of prayer is. God's plan for this world goes forward through the lives of ordinary people who are willing to be governed by him. I love you guys, and thank you for letting me share. I know I went a little bit long. I hope that was helpful. Thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you, Pat.